The year was 1954. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was serving his first term in the White House.
That I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States.
Grace Kelly delivered an Academy Award-winning performance in The Country Girl. The New York Giants were on their way to winning the World Series.
There's a wild drive, way back in center field, way back, it is.
And you could buy a stamp for just 3 cents. The same year, the U.S. Supreme Court was working on a decision that would forever change the way the country viewed racial equality. At 12:52 p.m. on May 17th, the Supreme Court overturned its previous ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed legal racial separation for nearly 60 years.
You only have to look at the Dred Scott case when the United States Supreme Court rendered its decision saying that African Americans had no rights that whites were obligated to respect. You only have to look at 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson. Separate was never intended to be equal.
I think they were absolutely right to go ahead, and I think you had to get rid of Plessy. Plessy legitimized discrimination. I don't think that was necessarily what the court meant to do, but that at that time, that was what everybody was doing, every white person at least.
Segregation in the U.S. began almost immediately after the Civil War ended in 1865. Segregation, or division of the races by law, was a practice that existed in the South under the name Jim Crow. The practice allowed the society to remain separate but equal.
Now, when the U.S. entered World War II in 1941, the South was a fully segregated society. Everything from schools, churches, transportation, public bathrooms, hospitals, and even cemeteries were for whites or blacks, but never for both. It wasn't until the case of Brown versus the Board of Education that separate but equal would no longer be the law of the land.
It was something that even the man in the street could understand, that if you take children and separate them forcibly solely because of their race, that you are saying that the races are unequal, and guess who is inferior? And in that day and age, 1954, you couldn't do that any longer. You shouldn't have been doing it before, but you certainly couldn't do it then.
But I don't think the schools ever would have been equal anyhow. They would have built a brand new schoolhouse. In fact, I've had Southerners take me around, show me, say, I don't understand, look at that's the black schoolhouse there, look at it, it's much better than the white one. But the teachers, and that was sometimes, occasionally true, but the teachers were not.
Because what Brown v. Board of Education attempted to do was to bridge the gap between democratic theory and historic practice. Because the way our country espoused democracy and the way it practiced it with respect to people of color were two different things.
The case was named for an African-American Kansas man, the Reverend Oliver Brown, who tried to enroll his 7-year-old daughter Linda into an all-white elementary school in Topeka. Linda had to walk 1 mile through a railroad switchyard just to get to her black elementary school, even though the white school was only 7 blocks away. Oliver Brown became one of 13 plaintiffs recruited by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, in the fall of 1950 to sue the Topeka Board of Education.
My father pondered why. Why should our children have to travel so far to school, facing unbearable winter weather, waiting for a badly overcrowded school bus to carry them some 2 miles across town when there is a school only 4 blocks from our home? Why?
Our dad was one of those people that said yes. So set the myth aside that it was something that he initiated. He did not. He was person number 10 to say yes on that list of 13. Those 13 families were told to locate a white school nearest to your home, take your child, children, and a witness, try to enroll, come back and tell us what happened. February 28, 1951, when the case was filed, that's when it became known by our dad's name, Oliver L. Brown.
The case went all the way to the nation's highest court, the United States Supreme Court, where Chief Justice Earl Warren and 8 associate judges, including Robert H. Jackson, heard the arguments from NAACP attorney and future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. The case would be one of the last Justice Jackson would hear and is arguably the most important of his career. Jackson's law clerk, Barrett Prettyman, recalls the justice's cautious approach to the case. Prettyman says Jackson knew the time to end segregation was long overdue, but was keenly aware of a possible public outcry, and that the situation had to be handled delicately.
He knew within himself that the time had come, probably long since come, for segregation solely on the basis of race to be struck down. I mean, he knew that. But what he was wrestling with was, how do we say this? How do we even come to grips with it ourselves in making it sound as if it is in fact grounded in the law rather than just a change of heart on the part of 9 men. He was also concerned, I think, from discussions at the conferences or perhaps with individual justices, that the court was going to be looking for a scapegoat here and saying that people had misperceived or people had done the wrong thing or they hadn't paid attention to the law and so forth. And he knew, being the good lawyer that he was, that they hadn't misperceived anything. They'd done exactly what the Supreme Court had told them that they could do. Segregate on the basis of race so long as the facilities are sufficiently equal.
During the next 3 years, while the case was being argued, Oliver Brown was called into the ministry. He moved his family to the north side of Topeka. Linda was transferred to another all-black elementary school and continued to have to walk twice the distance it would have taken her to get to the all-white school just 3 blocks from her home. In May of 1954, the Supreme Court released its now famous decision that should have ended segregation.
That evening in our home was much rejoicing. I remember seeing tears of joy in the eyes of my father as he embraced us, repeating, "Thanks be unto God."
But the one wonderful thing that Brown did for the country immediately, it placed the issue of race squarely on the national agenda. We were no longer living in the United States of denial. We couldn't pretend anymore that everything was all right on the racial front, if you will. So African Americans began to ask themselves, if it is not legal to be kept separate in classrooms, how could it be legal in transportation, at lunch counters, in public accommodations, and even in the halls of Congress?
But the feeling of joy in the African American community was short-lived. The ruling ending legalized segregation came, and as Justice Jackson feared, it gave little to no direction to judges in the U.S. District Courts on how to implement the change.
He was also concerned, as you know from his concurring opinion, about simply turning all of this back to poor district judges living down there with their neighbors in the deep South who could even be in harm's way, and who could not say, I'm merely doing what the Supreme Court told me to do, when the Supreme Court was not telling them to do anything except use your good judgment.
On October 9th, 1954, just 4.5 months after the historic Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board, Justice Robert H. Jackson suffered a fatal heart attack. He was 62 years old. Now, before his death, Jackson made it clear that he was concerned simply throwing the ruling back to the U.S. District Courts would create chaos. He was right.
I think he would have had a pretty good guess that it was going to be about as difficult as it has been, that it would be successful in some places, be done very quickly, harmoniously. In other places, it would be done, but it would be difficult and create a lot of hard feelings. And then in the third set of places, it wouldn't be done at all. He was so practical.
Nearly a year after the first ruling was handed down, the case was back in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Brown versus the Board of Education, too, was re-argued before the Supreme Court in April of 1955. As Jackson predicted, the original ruling left the district courts with very little guidance on how it should be implemented. Jackson's former law clerk, Barrett Prettyman, did most of the research for the second case.
I had mixed emotions about it because while I agreed with him that had an element of unfairness in it, I also saw all the complexities of the systems and wondered how in the world if the court was going to tell them how to do it, what in the world would it say that would meet all of these disparate systems? So I was pretty torn.
Brown versus Board 2 tackled the problem of how to enforce the first ruling. On May 31st, 1955, Chief Justice Earl Warren ordered the district courts to take the Supreme Court's opinion and admit all public schools on a racially non-discriminatory basis with all deliberate speed.
There was very definitely a strong sense on the part of the court that to establish a firm deadline for compliance, which is what Marshall wanted, he would have liked to have had desegregation go into effect starting with the school year 56-57. The Brown 2 was issued in May of 55. It would have given them another year. But the court was just very aware of the opposition that this would whip up, and they shied away from it.
Without that undertaking on a gradual basis outlined in Brown 2, I don't think you would have had Brown 1, or at least you wouldn't have had Brown 1 on a unanimous basis with no concurring or dissenting opinions. To be, I guess, brutal about it, you might say that Brown 2 is a price you had to pay for Brown 1.
The struggle to integrate public schools in the South only intensified. In September of 1957, 3 years after the Supreme Court overruled separate but equal in Brown versus Board, a massive riot broke out at Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. The schoolyard became a battleground for rioters and the National Guardsmen who were there to protect the 9 black teenagers who tried to attend. It wasn't until 2 years after the riots began that Arkansas public schools became fully integrated. Many people hoped that by 1963, integration would have already been achieved. But on June 11th of that year, Alabama Governor George C. Wallace came into the national spotlight when he kept a campaign promise to stand in the schoolhouse door to block the integration of the state's public schools.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Wallace's defiant attitude toward the Constitution came to a head when he tried to stop 2 African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from enrolling at the University of Alabama. Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach recalls his now famous stare-down with Wallace.
Everybody knew what was going to happen. Right. We didn't have to communicate with the governor. He knew perfectly well when he'd had his day in the sun, or out of it. Yep. That we were going to federalize the troops and he'd have to get out of there. He knew that. Right. He knew the students were going to be admitted. And that's why I say it was a charade. I mean, we had talked, we didn't have to go through that. From a matter of law, we could regard the students as registered. The court had ordered them registered. We could have treated that as done. Right. Simply sent them to class. In fact, I even suggested that to Bobby, and he said no. He said, I think that would cause violence. We've got to give the governor his confrontation.
Governor of the state of Alabama. Alabama action raised issues between the central government and the sovereign state of Alabama.
Just as Attorney General Robert Kennedy wanted, Governor George Wallace got his confrontation, but his attempt failed. Governor Wallace stepped aside and returned to the state capitol, allowing the students to enter, escorted by Katzenbach.
I had to go right through their police line to do it. They didn't know what to make of it. They didn't know what the hell I was doing. We just walked right through to her dormitory, and then they began to realize what we were doing. They did not. Frank Rose had not told them that this was going to happen. And we went in, the house mother came down and said, "Oh, you must be Vivian."
The civil rights movement was in full swing. The March on Washington, where the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his now famous I Have a Dream speech, occurred in August of 1963.
We will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
President Kennedy was working on his civil rights bill, but in the South, resistance to integration was persistent. Kennedy knew any change was going to take legislation.
So the only answer was, with the great dangers of violence and the actual violence that occurred, was to try to get legislation. And that was a very iffy proposition. And Kennedy, I think, took the earliest possible moment that he could have taken, probably reluctantly, because he didn't have total confidence that he could get legislation through. There was no way you could have had total confidence.
After Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson continued his efforts. In 1964, President Johnson called for and received the most comprehensive Civil Rights Act in United States history.
Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
Now, Katzenbach, who served in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, says LBJ, a brilliant politician, played off the public's grief using Kennedy's death to get the Civil Rights Bill through Congress. Many believed public sensitivity would not have allowed any deliberate or obvious attempts to damage the Civil Rights Bill the late president had worked so hard on.
Lyndon Johnson, when Kennedy was killed, used the bill, used Kennedy's assassination in part to try to help get votes for the bill. That was a good idea. And he said to Bobby, it's your bill, and I will do whatever you ask me to do in support of it. Now, you could regard that as a very generous offer, or you could regard it as a very cynical offer.
The case of Brown versus the Board of Education was reopened 2 more times. In November of 1979, the case was brought up when the courts discovered the Topeka schools were still segregated in certain ways. This time, the district formed a policy called open enrollment, allowing students to transfer from school to school. In July of 1994, Brown versus Board was reopened for the 3rd time that century. Now, one particular Topeka school district was presenting a new proposal dealing with the closings of some schools, reassigning students, and restructuring curriculum. The Brown sisters say despite the sacrifices of thousands of people, many inner-city schools across the country remain economically segregated, leaving the fight for racial equality unfinished.
There is still de facto segregation throughout much of the United States. The trouble does not stem from the fact that schools are not equal in their physical makeup, but the problem lies within the physical makeup of the inner city. The housing patterns are still causing us today to find predominantly all Black and Hispanic schools in certain areas. We witness every day the problem of urban renewal, the building of low-income housing in a neighborhood that is already 90% Black, thereby making the school of that neighborhood 99% Black.
The Reverend Oliver Brown died in 1961 at the age of 42. If he lived, his daughters believe he would have joined the civil rights movement of the 1960s. But nevertheless, Brown remains an important figure in U.S. history.
Little did he know that years ago, when he stepped off the witness stand, he stepped into the pages of history. I didn't understand what was happening then, but it was clear that Brown versus the Board of Education was a necessary victory. It might have been a little flame, but it served to set off a mighty flame.
Although the case laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1960s and led to major changes in the way race is viewed in our society, the long-term impact on the country's educational system remains unclear.
And while Brown versus the Board of Education took the legal steps necessary to ensure equal educational opportunities for all American children, to this day it remains the responsibility of the nation to see it through.
For the Robert H. Jackson Center and Time Warner Cable, I'm Casey Bortnick.
And I'm Brooke Busink. Thanks for watching.